What a week for investigative journalists covering the White House. One explosive headline after another. The president calls it a witch hunt. But could these revelations lead to the end of his administration? I'm Mark Kelley, in for Diana Swain. The Investigator starts now.
We have more breaking news now.
The president has tried to directly influence the Justice Department.
Trump revealed highly classified information to Russian foreign minister.
Our stories have had significant impact, and they all hold up.
The reporting is coming from anonymous sources who refuse to come out in the light. I think the Trump base is very skeptical.
That's where the American media are right now, stumbling around in a sightless rage, screaming.
God bless the American press. We wouldn't be having a special counsel. These reporters hadn't done that job.
We are the Investigators. This is what we do. President Donald Trump regularly slams leaks coming from inside the U.S. government and may have even mused about jailing journalists who report them. But that hasn't slowed the deluge of information being passed on to investigative journalists.
Trump told Comey, quote, "I hope you can let this go."
The president called Mr. Comey a nut job.
President Trump reportedly revealed highly classified information to Russia's foreign minister.
Explosive stories brought to light by the work of investigative journalists and rocking a White House already in damage control mode after last week's firing of FBI Director James Comey.
I think I made it clear last week that the president has nothing further on that hunter.
The New York Times story was based on a memo reportedly written by Comey after an Oval Office meeting with Trump.
According to U.S. media, Trump said to Comey, "I hope you can see your way clear to letting this go, to letting Flynn go. He's a good guy."
The White House denies Trump ever said that.
3 words: obstruction of justice.
The White House also rejected reporting by The Washington Post. Greg Miller, who covers the intelligence beat, was one of the journalists to report Trump gave highly sensitive intelligence to the Russians.
The story that came out tonight, as reported, is false. And I was in the room. It didn't happen.
The story broke the Post's all-time record for the number of people clicking on one of its pieces.
But if it's true, he will get no defense on this.
What does this investigative reporting tell us about the state of the U.S. administration?
Greg, several stories coming out this week that were relying on anonymous sources. I'm curious to know just what's going on in the White House. Why is it that people want to share information with journalists like yourself?
Well, I think that in some ways their motivations are no different than they've ever been, and there are many, many motivations for sources who come to speak to journalists like myself. I think in this case it's more pronounced because it's such a highly charged atmosphere and there is so much turmoil surrounding this administration that the level of concern, the sort of internal concern about what's happening, about mistakes that are being made, about the way things are handled, is extreme, and so I think in some cases there are people who are interested or have motivations to try to describe what's happening inside, just out of profound concern.
But you know, the minute these come from anonymous sources, the Trump camp and the president himself will say this is fake news because there are no names attributed to the information that comes out. How do you handle that kind of criticism?
It gets tiresome, I have to admit, especially now because it's really just become such a reflexive refrain, not only for the White House, but for a lot of sort of critics of the media. It's just something so easy to say and so hard to back up, I think, this fake news charge. But really, I mean, what matters to me is that our stories have had significant impact and they all hold up extraordinarily well. I mean, it was our coverage this year that led to Mike Flynn being fired as the National Security Advisor. It was our reporting this year that led to the Attorney General recusing himself from the Russia investigation. And despite what the White House was saying this week about the story about Trump revealing sensitive information to Russia, I mean, the facts have not been refuted, and if you listened carefully to how the White House was talking about that story, they essentially confirm all of its main elements.
I'm wondering, too, we've heard the president using the term witch hunt, saying that he is the victim of a witch hunt and you know, referring to journalists like yourself. What do you think about the climate that's now being created in Washington and the difficulty it makes for you to do your job?
Well, I mean, we're not engaged in a witch hunt. And I think that people forget how hard we worked as journalists to subject the Obama administration to meaningful coverage, to meaningful scrutiny, how hard we worked, how hard my colleagues here at the Post worked to subject Hillary Clinton to tremendous scrutiny while she was running for president. I mean, this is our job. This is what we do. And I think Trump has an inflated kind of sense of injury here. He tends to be fairly self-absorbed as an individual, so it's not surprising that he only sees this in terms of how he sees himself as being mistreated. But ultimately, what we're writing about are his actions, his behavior, and the behavior and conduct of his administration.
Greg Miller, great to talk to you. Thanks so much for your time.
Sure.
As negative headlines about Donald Trump pile up, so does criticism about the way some journalists are covering his administration.
Something about the coverage of him is totally different from anything I have seen in 30 years here, and it's bad.
That sentiment is shared by many of Trump's supporters, who remain dismissive of the work being done by investigative journalists.
Many of them see this as the work of the deep state. That is what they call intelligence agents and bureaucrats who they believe are working with the mainstream media to get rid of Donald Trump.
That mistrust and hostility was on display in a fundraising email this week, which called this week's revelations fake news, an echo of last year's election campaign.
I am a patriot, and you are a traitor!
Many Trump supporters are seeking out alternative voices, including right-leaning Breitbart and Fox News.
I'm Kurt Schilling. I'm Vince Egan. And we are Breitbart. Our goal is to disrupt the message of the mainstream media.
America is a country divided along political lines. Is that also coloring how people see investigative journalism? Chris Pandolfo is a staff writer at the Conservative Review.
Chris, Donald Trump was saying this week that he feels he's being treated worse and more unfairly than any other president in history. Do you think there's any truth to that comment?
Well, I think you could certainly take a look at the media and just the amount of ratio of negative stories written about the president to positive stories. And, you know, every president gets criticism. I think it's fair to say that some of the intensity of the criticism we've seen so far has been more than we've seen in the past. But maybe that's a fault of the administration, how it's being run.
Well, the press always likes to see itself as being, you know, holding power accountable, and that's our role. But the Trump administration sees the press and the media as the opposition. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think to a certain extent you have liberal journalists and liberal papers who do not like what the administration is doing. And so when they cover the things that they're doing, they do it with a very critical lens that's not always upfront or honest about it. If you look at Conservative Review, for example, we're a conservative website. It's in the title. When we criticize the president, we let you know we're doing this because we're conservatives and we don't think what he's doing is conservative. And some of the more mainstream news organizations that pretend to be more objective, I think some of their critical biases some of their biases slip into their reporting, maybe unintentionally, and they're not very upfront about it.
Do you look at outlets like the New York Times or the Washington Post as being biased right now?
I think some of the writers are biased. I think at other times the reporting's fairly good. It varies from piece to piece. You know, it's very hard to write an objective story if you're going to add analysis or commentary to it and go beyond just straight reporting of the facts. And you know, a lot of the way you can perceive bias in the media is what they cover, what they choose to cover, and what they don't choose to cover. You know, if you're someone in the Trump administration, you'll argue, well, they're covering all this Russia stuff, and there's no evidence to confirm any of the speculation we're seeing in the mainstream media. But they're not covering some of the successes of the administration, like the jobs numbers that are looking pretty good for this presidency, some of the regulations they're repealing, and some of the better business climate we're seeing. The administration would make that case, I think.
Has the Trump base, has it lost total faith in the mainstream media now?
I think the Trump base is very skeptical. you have just to take this week, for example, you have a slew of stories in places like the Washington Post and the New York Times that are citing anonymous sources leaking to the press that have been damaging for the administration. And I think that people look at these anonymous sources and they look at the slogan for the Washington Post that says "Democracy dies in darkness." Well, all their reporting is coming from anonymous sources who refuse to come out in the light. And when you have some of these reports that are being denied by the White House, if you take the report earlier this week that Rod Rosenstein, the Deputy Attorney General, was threatening to resign because he was being blamed for suggesting that Comey should be fired, it turned out that wasn't true. And so a lot of these times you have new news that contradicts the initial breaking news that created a viral media storm. And people look at that and they just feel like it's not serious since none of this reporting sticks.
Chris, good to get your point of view. Thanks for your time.
And thank you for having me.
We're also digging into a story here at home. A northern community coping with suicide, finding hope in an unlikely place.
We knew how important dancing was to this community.
How she found and captured this remarkable story next. Plus,
Pirates.
The latest Pirates of the Caribbean sequel, held for ransom by hackers. One of 5 things we learned from investigative journalism this week. But first, live from New York.
It's Saturday night!
What a season it's been for Saturday Night Live.
And listen, I love kids, okay? I love them so much I marry them.
I do like how generous he is. Just last Friday, he handed me this election.
The show, which wraps up its 42nd season this weekend, had its finger on the pulse of an unprecedented election and its aftermath, with one viral sketch.
Hi, Steve, you look rested.
Thank you.
After another.
And he's putting up walls, he's kicking people out. Trump is gut renovating the country like it's a crack house on flip or flop.
And unforgettable characters that, well, gave their real-life inspirations a run for their money.
Hootie? Oh my God!
I'll talk to the Russians.
And of course, no conversation about SNL these days can do without.
I came out here to punch you!
It's all added up to the biggest ratings for SNL in 23 years and left viewers wondering what season 43 has in store.
Here are 5 things we learned this week from investigative journalists. Several credit union employees told CBC's Go Public they feel the same pressure as workers at Canada's big banks to meet ambitious sales targets. A National Post investigation found only 45% of the money spent by Canadian cancer charities in 2013 went towards fighting cancer. More than half of the $2.7 billion went towards fundraising and other overhead expenses. CBC News reported the Aga Khan's private island, which hosted Prime Minister Justin Trudeau last December, is owned by a company with ties to corporations located in countries known to be tax havens. Hollywood Reporter and Deadline.com reported hackers stole a copy of Disney's upcoming Pirates of the Caribbean sequel and threatened to release it unless the company paid a huge ransom. Disney has refused to pay and is instead working with federal investigators. And the association that represents insurance companies in Canada urged its members to stop denying claims made by victims of domestic violence when their partners destroy a shared property. A CBC News investigation found several cases where a victim's claim was denied after their partner set fire to their home. Good original journalism takes you to places you may never go to and introduces you to people and stories that deserve to be heard.
News audiences don't often get access to stories from remote communities in Canada's north, but this week journalists Keitra Kahana and Ed O have painted a stunning portrait of life in a small town on the western shore of Hudson's Bay. They've documented an annual dance competition in Arviat, a community of about 2,800 people in Nunavut. Young people here have been preparing for this night for months, hoping to win the big prize, $2,000 and bragging rights for a year. But the competition means so much more to the people of Arviat. It's a chance for a community that's lost so many young people to suicide to come together and heal. Like many remote Indigenous communities, Arviat struggles with poverty, lack of employment, and overcrowding, and that's given many young people here a sense of hopelessness.
Suicide is a huge problem here in this town. We lost so many friends.
But music and dance are giving Arviat's youth hope.
It's my granddaughter, $2,000 winner.
So how did Keitra Kahana and Ed O first learn about Arviat and its love of dance?
Keitra, I just love this story. Saw it this week on the CBC. Thought it was fantastic. So well done. And I'm just curious to know what it was. You followed stories around the world. How did you end up in Arviat?
So Edo and I, we've been working for the last 10 years, mainly abroad, and it was really on the heels of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that we felt, as journalists, it's our obligation to come home and take part in that dialogue. And so it's really, as every Canadian should ask themselves, how can we contribute to that conversation? And so we started going up to Nunavut a couple of years ago, have made multiple trips, and have been looking to tell stories that give agency and allow people up north to tell their own stories.
Well, you know, I think some people would think this is a story about suicide, and they'd think maybe it's going to be a downer, and yet there was so much joy and there was so much hope in this. How did you find that right balance to be telling about the joy, but also, you know, acknowledging that the grief and the struggles of this community?
I think the story unfolded naturally. Like, we knew how important dancing was to this community. We used to go to the teen dance. Every Friday night there's a teen dance. And so we started interviewing young people about what dance meant to them, and this story of suicide came up naturally. And so we came to learn how important the dance competition is as a moment to raise awareness and to the youth, and to ask the youth, like, to not hurt themselves, to love themselves, to feel proud of themselves.
I found it to be a very intimate portrait. It was almost as like you as the filmmakers weren't there, and they were just almost like speaking freely among themselves. Was that your intention, to try to step back and just let them do the talking?
Absolutely. We see ourselves as vehicles for the story, for our subjects to directly connect to audiences around Canada, around the world, and to speak directly to them. And that's really my belief of what journalism and what filmmaking can do. It brings hearts directly to other hearts, and I really hope that that's what we've done in this.
Yeah, and how did they react, the subjects of the film? How did they react to it once they saw themselves in this?
So we've been in touch with most of our subjects since the film aired, and even just this morning I was talking to Ian, one of the dance competitors in the film, and I was saying to him, I'm so proud of you. I'm so proud of that your voice is out there and that you're going to inspire and bring hope to so many. And I kind of waited in anticipation for what he would say to me, and then he wrote back, "We're proud of you, thank you." And I said, let's do this again, let's create something great together. And he said, we will. So I just love that. And you know, we hope that we're only doing good with every project that we do, and I hope that's true in this story as well.
It certainly is. It's a film full of heart. Keitra, thanks so much for talking to us tonight.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
The people who are eating here are people who slept here last night.
Your chance to ask me anything is next. How this story, 7 days inside a homeless shelter, changed me.
I'm Dwight Drummond. Take a look around you. Nearly half of everyone in Toronto now calls a condo or high-rise home.
And that comes with challenges, dealing with neighbors that live above, below, and beside you, seniors, families, and millennials all sharing the same space.
If you're gonna live in such tight quarters, we're gonna have to give a bit, right?
Tell us your vertical living stories, the good and the bad. This is our vertical city, and it's our future. See what that future looks like in the coming days on CBC Television, Radio, and online.
What we aim to do with this program is to bring you into investigative journalism, take you behind the scenes of what we do. And part of that is to have you ask me anything. And this week, Toby asks, what was the most exciting, life-changing story that you've ever covered? Well, Toby, that's a tough one because I've been doing this for a long time, but it was a few years ago that I did a series for the National called 7, where I would spend 7 days in someone else's shoes. And one of the topics I was asked to cover was homelessness. So I moved into the Old Brewery Mission. It's a shelter in my hometown of Montreal for 7 days. And I got to say, when I walked in there for the first time, I was petrified, looking around, wondering how I would be received by these people there. I was trying to get a perspective on what it was that was driving so many people into homelessness, not only in Montreal, but in cities right across this country. And it was a life-changing experience for me as I met a former banker and a grandmother, both gambling addicts. I met the son of a millionaire family in Montreal who is now a crack addict, and a woman from a prominent Montreal family who is an intravenous drug user. It really changed stereotypes for me and gave me a new perspective on the people, and realizing that so many of us are just one step away from ending up where they were, the lowest of the low, and that's how they were seen by so many people in our society. But they're good people, fighting people, people who really needed a better chance and a helping hand from all of us. And that story always stays with me because I remember that one thing that woman passed on to me. A woman who was part of a prominent Montreal family, and I asked her, what was the lesson? You went from so high to so low. And she said the lesson she learned is you've always got to learn the lesson. And I did. Thanks, Toby, for that question. Remember, if you've got a question about investigative journalism, email us, investigators@cbc.ca. I'm Mark Kelley. Diana Swain will be back next week. Till then, we are the Investigators.